I'm Shane Morris. Thanks for listening to the BreakPoint Podcast. Religion is not just one lifestyle choice among many, not at least according to the U.S. Constitution. In fact, as Princeton's Dr. Robert George tells John Stonestreet on today's BreakPoint Podcast, in our constitutional tradition, religion is singled out for special care. It isn't a variant of freedom generally. Our founding fathers, those who bequeathed to us this great constitutional government, understood that religion has to do with conscience. So, at a time when so many Americans, not to mention our lawmakers and local officials, fail to understand religion's privileged status under the Constitution, Christians must be especially vigilant to protect our religious freedoms, even as we make sacrifices during the current pandemic. Here are John Stonestreet and Dr. Robert George, McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University.
Well, welcome to the BreakPoint Podcast. It's always an honor and a privilege when I can have Professor Robert P. George, the one and only, one of the great constitutional scholars of our day, as well as a great expert on religious freedom. And I just want to talk about today, Professor George, just all kinds of issues surrounding religious freedom and civil liberties and government overreach and all the things that some of us are beginning to notice after kind of doing our duty and staying home during the pandemic. What does this mean going forward? But before I go there, I think I speak for all of America when I say thank you for the daily banjo minute on Twitter during this pandemic. That's been one of the bright spots of the whole thing.
Well, you're very kind, John. And let me say what a pleasure it is to be back on the broadcast. It's been some time now, and I'm glad we're back in touch.
I think a lot of people don't know that about you, that your West Virginia upbringing led you to almost a breakthrough musical career in country western and kind of the great bluegrass music. And my dad's from West Virginia, so I just think it's a great addition to the American culture.
Well, you know, I just hide behind this Ivy League professorship and all those academic degrees and all that stuff. I was born and brought up in the hills of West Virginia in the heart of Appalachia. Both of my grandfathers were coal miners. My paternal grandfather was in the mines and working on the railroads really his entire life. My mother's father was able eventually to get out of the mines, save up some money, and open a little business. Both grandfathers died of lung disease. As so many people did who worked in the coal industry, of course, in those days. I was actually saved, as I think back on the history of my family, saved from the mines by World War II, because when my father was drafted at age 18 into the service to go to the war over in Europe, where he did serve, when he came back from the war, he had alternatives. He had options other than the coal mines. Otherwise, he would have been in the coal mines, and I suppose I would have been in the coal mines as well. So I'm grateful that I escaped the mines, but I'm a West Virginian through and through, West Virginian at heart. I've had my banjo with me from the moment I left the state to go to college. I've never let it out of my sight. I continue to play it, not only because I love the music, but it's such a reminder of where I came from and who I am.
Well, there's got to be a sum total of one Princeton professors who play banjo. I'm guessing there's probably a limited number of you. But for those of you that don't know Professor George, he's the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence at Princeton University, also the director of the James Madison Program, one of the co-authors, along with Chuck Colson and Timothy George, of the Manhattan Declaration, has done probably more in areas of bioethics, religious freedom, and just civil liberties, almost than anyone, especially in the Catholic and conservative Christian tradition. Professor George, here's what I wanted to talk to you about today. And I think your story about your dad coming back from kind of a global disaster and the new options that were there. We know that at times like these, we give up freedoms, we give up liberties, we've given up mobility, we've given up meeting together as churches. And yet we only have to think back to 9/11 to think about freedoms that were given up in the name of the Patriot Act, freedoms that were given up in the name of safety. And there's some concern happening right now about what we see in terms of government overreach, particularly at the state level. And I just want you to talk us through it. Are people who have these sorts of concerns that people have, are they conspiratorial? Are they overblown? Do you share some of these concerns?
Well, we should have concerns. Now, we have to be careful to keep our concerns in check. They have to be reasonable concerns, but there are reasonable grounds for concern here. There always are in circumstances in which catastrophes, whether they're man-made or natural, it could be a war, it could be an earthquake. Whenever there are catastrophes, freedoms will have to be, to some extent, limited or abridged. But whenever that happens, no matter how good the cause is, we have to be careful to avoid doing the kinds of things that will permanently limit our freedoms when we get beyond the catastrophe. There will, in this vale of tears among human beings, frail, fallen creatures that we are, always be people who are too eager to have power that comes at the expense of other people's liberties. And they will use disasters when people legitimately and rightly give up some freedom for security, for safety. They will seize the opportunity to grab more power for themselves. And so we have to be wary about that. So it's very wrong to condemn anyone who expresses concerns as a nut or as a conspiracy theorist. Now, you can go too far. You can imagine that there's nothing the government has to do, or that we needn't sacrifice any liberties in the face of a disaster. Again, whether it's a war, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's an earthquake or a hurricane or something like that, you can go too far. But it's important to keep things in balance. We must avoid erring in either of the two directions.
Yeah, it's a tough balance to have, and I know a lot of believers are finding that balance quite difficult when it comes to meeting as churches. I think for a while, particularly maybe under the last administration, Professor George, we found ourselves at odds so often with the federal government and with kind of federal rulings and with different levels of government that we almost think that we should be at odds with them whenever they say something. And I think many churches decided not to meet, and it was a wise decision. It was coming together, in a sense of wisdom, out of love of neighbor, out of not wanting to pass on this disease and that sort of thing. But at the same time, we saw some really crazy comments made by, for example, Mayor de Blasio. We've had some things that he said where it sounded even anti-Semitic just recently. And, when is it okay for the church to get back together? Are you sensing this is something that Christians are going to need to be more aggressive on, maybe, than we thought?
Well, we're going to need to insist on our rights. Now, we don't want rights that are greater than anybody else's rights, greater than the rights of members of any other religious community, greater than the rights of secular people. We're certainly willing as Christians. We should be willing. I believe we are willing to do our parts to make our share of sacrifices, including the sacrifice of mobility, staying home, even not gathering for religious services, where those sacrifices are in fact necessary. But we should not be willing to make those sacrifices. We should stand up to government when those sacrifices are not necessary and there's some other agenda playing out here. There's something else going on. Now, let me put on my constitutional law scholar hat here. When it comes to what are called neutral laws of general applicability, that is, laws that are not targeted at any particular religion or other group, they're neutral theologically. And of general applicability, that is, they're meant to apply to everyone. When it comes to those sorts of laws, only under the narrowest circumstances, only under the most compelling conditions, should we, and do we, ask for exemptions. But when we look at our situation today, we see that in some states, churches remain closed. The government is not even permitting Christians and other believers, also people from other religions, synagogues, mosques, to gather in the church building or on the church lawn, or for that matter, even the parking lot in cars, while at the same time, we see liquor stores open, we see lotto sales outlets open, we see abortion clinics open. Now we have to begin wondering, wait a minute, this does not look anymore like a neutral law of general applicability. The laws are not fair, or not being administered fairly, I should say. The government is favoring, let's say, abortion clinics over churches, favoring liquor stores, which generate revenue for government, among others, so do lotto sales. There are powerful lobbies behind those so-called industries. That includes the abortion industry, by the way, with its powerful lobby. When we see favoritism, then it's time to stand up. The other point I'd make here, John, is the sacrifices that people are being asked to make, the restrictions that they're being asked to labor under, need to be properly modulated. There are times when the correct thing to ask people to do is to stay away from gatherings of any sort. But as conditions change, or as conditions become clearer, and it becomes clearer that we can afford to have people get together so long as they observe proper social distancing norms, then the law should change in order to accommodate that. At a minimum, there's no reason now, certainly in most parts of the country, for people not to gather for services in a church parking lot, for example, perhaps staying in the cars. In some cases, it would be acceptable from a public health point of view to gather physically, maybe even in the church building itself, maybe staying 6 feet apart. There are ways to accommodate the legitimate religious needs of people, short of a complete ban on any gatherings, where a complete ban on gatherings is not absolutely needed. The other and final point I'll make, John, before handing it back to you, is this distinction people want to draw between the essential and the non-essential. Now, of course, from the believer's point of view, our faith is essential. Now, that doesn't mean that we necessarily have to be able to get together in community, although Christian faith is never purely an individual matter. Christian faith is always a matter of community, not just the atomized, isolated individual. But it does mean, especially for those from sacramental traditions, that we're sacrificing something very, very powerful, very, very profoundly important when we are not able to get together for our worship. That's not something we can dismiss as inessential. So if the government wants us to bear that burden, it in turn must meet a very high standard of proof, a very high standard of showing that these sacrifices really are necessary to protect human lives.
My guest today on the BreakPoint Podcast is Professor Robert P. George, who's the professor of jurisprudence and director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton, and also, as we said earlier, the driving force behind the Daily Banjo Minute. He's up to day 41 on that, by the way, which is quite impressive. You can find that on Twitter. I always say, if you're not on Twitter, don't start. But if you are on Twitter, you can find Professor George at McCormick Prof. I'm glad you brought up the essential, non-essential, Professor George. That's been one of the things that I've struggled with trying to make sense of, because I know at some level these are kind of official semantic categories to help, just make some decisions and put people in, put gatherings and groups and services into different categories. But we live in a cultural moment that is so highly secularized, where religion, religious belief, pastoral services, pastoral counseling, the sacraments, those sorts of services are so secularized in the sense that they're considered personal and private sorts of preference things, that they're not dealing with reality.
Yeah, it's worse even than that. John, I was saying it's worse even than that. Everything you've just said is true. But for some of our secular fellow citizens and friends, they are so lacking in understanding of what religion is from the point of view of the believer,
right,
that they essentially see it as a hobby. Some people like chess, some people like football, some people like ballet, some people like going to church, some people like religion. But whatever's to be said about religion in our constitutional tradition, this much has to be said. It is singled out for special care. We see that in the Constitution. We see that in the First Amendment. Religious freedom isn't just a variant of freedom generally. It's a specific thing that is singled out for special attention because it's not reducible to just an interest or a hobby. Our founding fathers, those who bequeathed to us this great experiment in constitutional government and Republican ordered liberty, understood that religion has to do with the conscience. It's what Newman called, the 19th century theologian John Henry Newman called a stern monitor. Mm-hmm. It's what calls us to duty, to obligation from a higher source, from God himself. That's not like chess or football or ballet or collecting stamps or any other hobby.
Yeah, well, that's such an important distinction, because then you hear the words, they've been, repeated from Governor Cuomo, a couple weeks ago. God didn't do this. Miracles didn't do this. We did this. when you hear somebody who has that sort of disdain for miraculous intervention, and you compare it to, governmental leaders in the past. I mean, certainly there were plenty of government leaders that didn't call national days of prayer, but there were a lot who did. But I can't remember any of them actually getting up. And, it's one thing to not give God credit. It's another thing to discredit God for any sort of progress being made. I guess that's an attitude that when someone uses then these official categories of essential, non-essential, I can't help but be concerned.
I don't want to be partisan about this. I think it's important that we try to not be partisan about this, John. And I certainly cringe at some of the things President Trump says, but I do cringe also at some of the things that Governor Cuomo says and some of the things that Mayor de Blasio says. What on earth gets into their heads to say these things? I have no idea. Is Governor Cuomo confident that God played no role in the success that we've had? Well, this would certainly place him in opposition not only to the great religious figures of our civilization and culture, but the great political leaders like George Washington, who saw the hand of God in the great success of our revolution and of our founding. Lincoln, who also understood that God was ultimately in charge and that the important thing for us was not so much to have God on our side, but to be on God's side. Now, does Governor Cuomo or any other politician think he is greater or smarter or better than Abraham Lincoln or than George Washington? I hope no. And not. And these comments from Mayor de Blasio recently have just been terrible, threatening to close down synagogues forever if they violate his rules. Most recently, calling out the Hasidic Orthodox Jewish community and saying, I have this message for the Jewish community. The time for arguments is over, and threatening to arrest people and shut things down. There's a kind of tin ear for an understanding of what faith means to people of faith, what its importance is, this tendency to treat faith as just another interest alongside others. And so we should have no more compunctions about shutting down a church or a synagogue than we have about telling people that they can't go to the football stadium for a football game. Or we should have at least the same compunctions that we have about saying you can't go to the liquor store. For the life of me, I can't figure out why the abortion clinics and the liquor stores and the lotto sales operations are allowed to continue as if they are essential when we're asking churches and synagogues to shut down.
Well, in Colorado, you have to add the pot stores.
I hope you're enjoying John Stonestreet's interview with Professor Robert George. I want to remind you that registration is open for our upcoming virtual event, Truth, Love, Together. We have an absolutely outstanding lineup of Christian worldview thinkers like Os Guinness, Johnny Erickson Tata, Sean McDowell, Dr. John Lennox, and many, many more. And we'll be presenting our annual William Wilberforce Award to a truly heroic man, Pastor Bob Fu, fondly known as the pastor of China's Underground Railroad and founder of China Aid. And folks, this event is absolutely free. It's ideal for families, small groups, and of course, for individuals. All you have to do is come to wilberforceweekend.org. That's wilberforceweekend.org. Now let's get back to John Stonestreet and Dr. Robert George.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the abortion one because that's certainly something we've seen as well. There's a high-profile case that ADF has picked up now in North Carolina, for example, where respecting social distancing guidelines, basically doing everything that the government had asked, a group that has been making their presence known outside of an abortion clinic for years now in Greensboro, North Carolina. Actually, some friends of mine, Love Life, Charlotte, arrested, even though they were following social distancing guidelines. They were doing everything that the current law had said. And we think about the number of pregnancy care centers that have been, forced to cease any sort of operation like that. And yet Planned Parenthood, wants to be a business when it wants to get, the payroll protection. It wants to be a essential activity. It wants to be a nonprofit when it wants to be a nonprofit. And there's an awful lot of, it seems, government support. That's what makes this really hard as well is, we don't want to be partisan, but good heavens, on the abortion issue, it's almost impossible not to be partisan right now.
Let me share a thought with you, John, and with your listeners here. It's really appalling and scandalous that someone would regard abortion as essential. In fact, it's scandalous that abortion is regarded as health care at all, much less, as the governor of Michigan dubbed it,
Right.
Governor Whitmer, I believe is her name. I've taken to calling her Morticia for reasons that will become obvious in a moment. It's just appalling and scandalous that she has declared that abortion is essential because it is a life-sustaining form of medical care. Heavens, what, quote, a life-sustaining form of medical care other than abortion produces a human corpse every single time it is successfully undertaken? Which one? Can name me something else that results in a human corpse every time it's performed? No, this is not healthcare at all. And the idea that it's essential is risible.
Well, she was one of the ones I was going to bring up, because moving on kind of outside of the religious freedom angle, just to the civil liberty side of things, Professor George, I think the confusion that some people have, and I think Michigan has become kind of Exhibit A, is just kind of the strange, draconian, nonsensical laws. I mean, first of all, you've got Detroit, and then you've got the rest of the state. So you've got a geographic distance there. You've got not only that, but then you have, things like, don't go to Home Depot, don't buy seeds, don't buy gardening supplies, don't go to your second home in northern Michigan. And I think some of these things seem so bizarre and so strange that's where this concern of giving up our liberties, it'd be, the Governor Newsom deciding kind of almost as punishment for Californians to close down all the beaches again. This isn't in the category of religious freedom. It's almost in the category of being an American and the power of local versus state versus federal. I mean, do you have any guidance for us on this?
Yeah, I think people's instincts are right when they rebel against one-size-fits-all solutions. One size does not fit all. This is a large, very diverse country. There are places where the virus, the epidemic, the pandemic has hit very hard, and others where it hasn't hit as hard. Just look at the distinction between New York City and upstate New York, or as you say, Detroit and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. It is foolish to imagine that exactly the same rules should apply in Detroit as apply in the Upper Peninsula. That's foolish. And you have to, it's so foolish and so manifestly foolish that you have to wonder what is really going on here. No intelligent, no sensible person could treat those as being exactly alike. And this is what's causing the suspicion and causing people to do things that I myself don't approve of. Evidently, there were some people who actually brought weapons into the gallery at the state legislature. Now, shouldn't be doing things like that, in my opinion. But you can see what is feeding the suspicions here. It's this idea of one size fits all, when in fact one size doesn't fit all, and it's manifest that one size doesn't fit all. We have, John, what's called a federal system. We have two levels of government, and they're related in an unusual way if you look at the whole history of political systems. Our central government is not in charge of everything, with any powers of state or local governments being derivative of central government and delegated from the central government to the lower levels. That's not our system. That is the system in other places, the system in France. That's the system in England and Britain. That's the system in China. It's not our system. Our system is a federal system. And under our system of federalism, the national government is a government of delegated and enumerated powers. Where those powers have been granted via the Constitution from the people to the national government is sovereign. But where those powers haven't been granted, the states are sovereign, and their powers aren't derivative of the national government or delegated by the national government. Their powers are plenary. Any powers not given to the national government are reserved to the states or the people, respectively. The states, unlike the national government, are governments of general jurisdiction. They exercise what we call, and we've inherited this concept from our English forebears, police powers, the powers to protect public health, safety, and morals, and to advance the common good. It's the national government's powers that are actually more limited, and we have a system of dual sovereignty. The national government is not completely or solely sovereign. It's sovereign within its sphere. The states are sovereign within their sphere. And even within the states, I think it's very important for state governors and state legislatures to understand that as a prudential and practical matter, laying aside the question of the actual contours of their official power, but as a prudential and practical matter, they've got to take into account regional and local differences. Detroit really is different from the Upper Peninsula, and to treat them as the same as it is, as I said, foolish. So here's where people who are in power in the states, where the governors, for example, need to be saying, look, some of the decision making here can't be made by me from the state Capitol or from the State House. It's got to be made by local officials, by mayors, by city councils, by county executives, by county commissions, and so forth. There needs to be a kind of distribution of power as an effective matter, as a prudential matter. Now, no question about it, formally, constitutionally, the states can dictate what goes on in Detroit and dictate what goes on in the Upper Peninsula. The states from the state capital can basically override what localities do, even municipalities do. But they have to be very careful and prudentially smart about using those powers.
Yeah, that framework, Professor George, is so helpful, and you can really see too at a time like this just the vision of the human person that drives policy, whether we're just physical people whose job is to avoid disease and sickness and death, or whether there's something inherent to us where work has something to do with meaning, and talk about social isolation. There's just so many other things we could talk about, but we're out of time here. And I just want to ask you one question. The thing I've always appreciated, Professor George, is although you've been in a position of great influence in our thinking about issues of jurisprudence, constitutional law, our thinking as citizens, especially as people of faith, and you've had access to some of the power centers of the American experiment, from the White House to congressional leaders, Supreme Court justices, and so on. You believe in the power of everyday people, especially Christians, to live out their faith and to do what they're supposed to do and to speak up. And I think a lot of us sense that something's off here, and it's not even maybe bad intentions. It might just be we've never done this before, at least in our lifetime, and we're kind of making it up as we go along. But at the same time, what would you say to people of faith? When you said earlier, we've got to speak up. What does that look like for us? Because again, I think a lot of people are, shouting and screaming as if immediately assuming motives, and that's probably not super helpful. But what does it look like right now for Christians to be rightly concerned and to speak up as they should?
One of the things Christians should be is the very best of good citizens. And again, we shouldn't ask for privileges from our government beyond those that are afforded to other people. And we should stand up for other people's rights, including people from other faith traditions. We should stand up for the rights of our Jewish neighbors, for those of our Muslim neighbors, and so forth. But we need to be good citizens. That's part of our mission. We are not of the world. There's a certain sense in which our real home is not of this world. It's of a different place. We're resident aliens, I think, as sometimes is said. And yet we're called on to be the very best of good citizens. Now, as Americans, what does that mean? John, in times of crisis, it's always best to go back to first principles, revisit first principles. What are the first three words of the Constitution of the United States? We, the people. That's where all power comes from, and that means that's where ultimately all responsibility lies. If we allow things to go off the rails, if we permit our leaders to take us down the road to perdition, ultimately we are responsible and we are accountable before God and man. We are accountable, we the people. So it's time for us to remind our leaders that we are ultimately responsible. We are ultimately in charge. Yes, in elections, we vote them into office, and we respect the authority that they hold as people who hold those offices. But we need to be prepared to do what it takes to remove them if they are not doing what's right, to call them out when they do what's wrong, to make sure that the democratic process is used truly to advance the common good, truly to advance the principles of justice and human rights. And that includes the rights of the child in the womb. That includes protecting the institution of marriage and the family. That includes protecting the religious liberty, not only of ourselves as Christians, but of our Jewish friends and of our Muslim friends and of people of all traditions of faith. We're accountable. We're responsible. Not just because we're Christians, although that certainly for those of us who are Christian puts an underscoring under it, but because we are citizens and as Christians called to be the best of good citizens.
Amen. My guest today, Professor Robert P. George, McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence, Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. He has published widely, including most recently the Cambridge Companion to Natural Law, Great Cases in Constitutional Law, and I think still the book that is just absolutely terrific, The Clash of Orthodoxies, published by ISI back in 2001, a groundbreaking book for me. We'll link to all this at breakpoint.org. And again, be sure to find Professor George on Twitter. It's a great way to follow him, including, and I'm going to give it one more good plug, the Daily Banjo Minute during quarantine. It's one of the great things that Twitter has to offer. Professor George, thanks for the lesson in the Constitution, the lesson in a courageous public Christian life that you've given us today on the BreakPoint Podcast.
Oh, you're so kind. Thank you, John. I hope to get back together with you again soon.
Sounds good.
Thanks, everyone, for listening to the BreakPoint Podcast. Remember, come to wilberforceweekend.org to register for next month's Truth, Love, Together virtual event to hear our outstanding lineup of Christian worldview thinkers. It's completely free and promises to be one of the great worldview gatherings of the year. Again, that's wilberforceweekend.org. For the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris.